Anthologies.
Anthologies.
Anthologies. Hi, I'm Hound. I'll be your host this evening, or whenever you're watching this. On this channel, we don't do top 10 lists or even typical movie reviews, at least not yet. Instead, I like to go a bit deeper into the niches of the horror genre and go over a bit of its history while attempting to give the viewer a deeper understanding of it. Maybe you'll learn something new, have something interesting to add in the comments for future viewers, or just walk away with a couple movies to watch. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoy as we go over anthology horror in film. So, first thing up on the agenda, what does the word anthology mean, and what can be classified as an anthology? The literal word comes from the Greek anthologia, which is a word meaning a collection of flowers. The Merriam-Webster dictionary definition is a collection of selected literary pieces or passages or works of art or music. This is a very broad, but decently accurate definition. However, when we start to list films like Pulp Fiction and the Looney Bugs Bunny movie under the same umbrella, it can be easy to see how muddy the waters can become. So, for the sake of this video, all a film has to do in order to be qualified as an anthology is feature 2 or more short stories, usually about 45 minutes, preferably less, and connected through a similar theme for the sake of cohesion, or with a wraparound segment linking the individual segments together. This is still a very wide definition of anthology, meaning potentially thousands of films and hundreds of horror films could be qualified as anthologies, depending on how lenient you want to be. If you were to require a wraparound or require that all stories be made by different directors, you would suddenly lose out on a lot of the good entries in anthology horror. So whether there's 1 director or 5, 3 stories or 8, if there's an integrated wraparound or not, or if it's just a collection of individual shorts, these are anthology horror films. Given any missing or destroyed films, as is sadly so frequent with early film history, Eerie Tales from fucking 1919 is the first anthology horror film, and actually just first anthology film in general, yet again showing that horror is always there at the genesis. The film has a wraparound of 3 characters, the devil, death, and the harlot, sitting around a library and telling spooky stories. All of the stories here do have something in common. They're incredibly juvenile. I don't feel like that's quite the right word to use, but hey, we're just gonna roll with it. They're not heavy or complex stories at all, and are very light on the horror, while still bringing a bit of a spook factor. The first 4 segments were actually based on short stories by acclaimed authors: Anselm Heim, Robert Liebman, Edgar Allan Poe, and Robert Louis Stevenson, respectively. Speaking of familiarity, this movie features a very recognizable face if you've seen early horror films: Conrad Veidt, who would later go on to work with Fritz Lang in the German expressionist masterpiece Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, that cemented his legacy in horror and film history. Something fun about the film is that the wraparound that features 3 characters, the devil, death, and the harlot, one of these things is not like the other, but the actors that are playing them all appear as the characters in the stories that are being told as well. Something fun and unique that wasn't often replicated by future anthologies. I like these early silent films, and even some of the bridging films between silent and talkies, because for silent films they almost always featured theater actors, who were exceptional at getting across emotions very loudly on screen. Sure, it does look weird at times, but I don't know. I just have a soft spot for it. Featuring a wraparound and even the first film adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's Black Cat, as well as the first anthology film being a horror film, Eerie Tales definitely set the tone properly for how anthologies should be, in my opinion. But there was seemingly a bit of a long jump between Eerie Tales and the next horror anthology. 26 years, in fact. I can't think of a reason why the 20s, 30s, and most of the 40s were a poor time to release horror movies. Nope, can't think of any reason at all. Dead of Night. Our next film was released in 1945. September of 1945. September 9th. You gave it a week? Anyways, in the wraparound directed by Basil Dearden, After a man arrives at a cottage seeking work, he experiences déjà vu, and then informs his fellow guests that he's met them all before in his dreams. The wraparound is of him trying to prove his having previously dreamed of the scenario, while the patrons each tell their stories. Dead of Night is a very influential horror film, and an even more influential anthology film. Unlike Eerie Tales, it features multiple different directors, a couple of them even doubling up on segments. It also has a mix of original writing, as well as adaptations, featuring themes that would become commonplace in horror. Ominous premonitions, spooky mirrors, and most notably, fucking dummies. One thing I noticed is that the cinematography in this film is very by the numbers, up until the end, where we get a bunch of creative decisions with mats and edits showing the main character involved in all of the stories that were showcased. They really pulled out all the stops for the finale of this anthology, including saving the best story for last.
Enough to drive a man mad.
Which should be in the blueprints for all anthologies, making sure that the audience leaves on a very high note. The stories on display here are also tame and harmless, that they're actually really charming in their own way.
You believe in ghosts?
Good Lord, no.
Neither do I.
Reminder, this was all back when showing a toilet flushing on screen was absurd and unheard of. In comparison to the modern horror films, of course they're going to feel a bit weaker. However, I think that The Haunted Mirror, and especially The Ventriloquist Dummy, showcase very unique ideas, all while the film bookends with an intriguing wraparound that makes the film a very enjoyable watch. From the very beginning, horror anthologies were taking direction from their cousin, the compilation novel, acting as almost an adaptation of greatest hits from famous authors. One funny little thing that I noticed is that the more recent the short story, to the time of it being recorded, the more dated that the movie felt. Adapting a story less than 20 years old just feels off. Like how some 70s films' idea of what the 2000s would look like just isn't. Conversely, adapting a story that's 40 plus years old is a large enough gap that it feels more akin to a period piece. The adaptation of older stories also posed a different problem. Their complexities were slim, meaning we got a lot of, hey, let's kill the old person for their money, plots that just end with vaguely supernatural comeuppance. Thankfully, when using older stories, rather than making these problems stick out, it tended to push them to the side. Frequently used authors are H.P. Lovecraft, one of Lovecraft's pupils, Robert Bloch, later Stephen King, and obviously Edgar Allan Poe himself, who was a perfect target for adaptation in my opinion, not only with his distance from the time period, but with Hammer horror and even Universal still being popular, a lot of people were very keen to see Gothic stories. But when talking about important writers in horror, we can't forget about Richard Matheson, who is responsible for I Am Legend, Steven Spielberg's Duel, and he's also one of 3 writers credited for Jaws 3D, peak cinema of the highest quality. However, there's one film in his repertoire that is most pertinent to this video. See, Matheson worked with Roger Corman on a series of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations for the screen, including Tales of Terror, directed by Roger Corman and written for the screen by Richard Matheson, features no wraparound and instead links the stories by Vincent Price voiceover, much like my hallucinations. The short stories being adapted here are Morella, Black Cat, and The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. Easily the breakout segment is The Black Cat, a contender for the best adaptation of the short story, mixing Black Cat with elements from The Cask of Amontillado,
That's correct, sir.
and even a bit of The Telltale Heart. Also in the film, seeing Peter Lorre and Vincent Price acting opposite each other is a real treat. Morella, as well, is notable for having beautiful cinematography and set design with some breathtaking paintings, all capped off wonderfully by the amazing score. Roger Corman, Richard Matheson, and Vincent Price, together with the help of Basil Rathbone, Maggie Pierce, and Peter Lorre, serve as a wonderful mixture of top talent coming together at a wonderful place and time to adapt a few of the best short stories from Edgar Allan Poe. I really cannot sing the praises of this film enough. The next year, we also got another big anthology film. Black Sabbath from 1963 is a Mario Bava-directed horror anthology featuring Boris Karloff as the host, who also appears in one of the 3 segments. The first segment is The Telephone, about a mysterious caller tormenting a woman who may have a history with them, which would go on to inspire both Black Christmas and Scream. The next segment is The Wordalak, a Serbian vampire story featuring Boris Karloff as the reanimated vampire patriarch of a farming family. And finally, the most cinematically striking of the bunch, The Drop of Water, wherein a woman goes Gollum mode over a ring of a dead psychic. These segments are finally capped off by, honestly, one of the best endings to a film that really kicks your ass back into your seat and reminds you what filmmaking is all about. Poetic. GG, Mr. Bava. So, why short stories in the first place? Why not just make everything into a feature film? I mean, shit, 65, 70 minutes? It's not a hard target to hit, right? Well, the sad fact... Fuck that. It's not a sad fact. It's an important fact. Not every story is meant to be feature length. Just because a story is short doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve to be told. Some of the most influential stories in history, be it about culture, folklore, or history, are in themselves short stories. Short stories are just as valid as feature ones, and anthologies gave those short stories a home and made them much more accessible to the public than if they had stayed as just shorts. So too did the writings and collections from Lafcadio Hearn take stories from Japanese culture, including their rich folklore, and spread them across the globe for all to enjoy, cementing him not only as one of the first documented weebs, but also a heavily influential writer who's still revered today for his part in preserving those stories. Kwaidan is an anthology horror film from Japan, consisting of 4 short stories from Lafcadio Hearn. Lacking a wraparound segment, this is more of a collection of very well-made shorts. Our first segment is The Black Hair, a super slow and thoughtful segment, quiet, isolating, and most of all, haunting, featuring beautiful sets that pair extremely well with the cinematography. Up next is The Woman of the Snow. I'm biased as all hell when it comes to this. Ever since I saw this story in Tales from the Dark Side, and later when I played Pokemon with Frostlass, I've been a huge sucker for the story of the Yuki-onna. It's just so damn enticing and unique, and this film takes such a beautiful and impactful story and combines it with some of the most awe-inspiring backdrops and set design, giving it such striking visuals that are truly unforgettable. The third story featured is Hoichi the Earless. Yeah, the dude on the cover. If you're interested in a story, then you might leave this one feeling unsatiated due to the slow pacing. But if you're interested in technical mastery, and yet again, creative set design with costumes and theatrics, then you will absolutely enjoy this segment. The moment that Hoichi starts to play for the spirits, and the stage becomes flooded with fog and transitions to depicting the ghosts of the people who fought in the battle, and that slow pull back to Hoichi especially, is one of the most memorable sequences of beautiful shots that I have ever seen. Our last segment is In a Cup of Tea. The weakest segment by far, but thankfully it's over quickly and doesn't ask too much of the viewer. By this point in my watches of this film, I'm usually worn down and ready to move on, and that's probably why they chose to put the shortest story last here. Kwaidan is easily one of the best anthologies to exist. Its only hindrance is the fact that it's 3 hours long, with segments that prefer to linger on shots and emotions, dragging down the pace. But in doing so, building up the impact of every storytelling decision. If you're a returning viewer, first off, thank you. Second, you know that I love when a film isn't afraid to hold on to a shot for a long time. So of course, I dig the hell out of this film. I've said it a bunch already, but this film really is just so beautiful and important. Speaking of influential writers and their legacy in regards to anthologies, Milton Subotsky, who co-founded the British production company Amicus in 1964 with Max J. Rosenberg, The studio was responsible for such films as The Land That Time Forgot, The Abominable Dr. Phibes, and for my fellow werewolf fans, The Beast Must Die, which is a Sherlock-inspired whodunit with a sort of werewolf culprit. But we're here for anthologies. Milton Subotsky, heavily inspired by 1945's Dead of Night, wanted to recreate that in his own way, initially with just Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, but apparently this wasn't enough, because this mad lad went on to write or produce 9 fucking anthology films. To say that he was a fan of the format is putting it lightly. This led Amicus to be mostly known as the 70s British anthology company, as it's definitely what they're remembered for. So let's go back to the beginning of this anthology machine's fascination with Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is a film released in 1965 by Amicus, directed by Freddie Francis of Hammer acclaim, written by our boy Milton Subotsky, and featuring a star-studded cast of many British legends. The film includes a wraparound of 5 passengers on a train, having charismatic Dr. Shrek, no doubt named after the Nosferatu actor, and not the ogre, perform tarot card readings for them. One by one, he details to them their futures and their gruesome fates, which act as the segments in this anthology. The stories themselves have very different vibes, from gothic horror to science fiction. And the final segment ends with a fun and enjoyable twist that even caught me by surprise. But the real twist is awaiting the passengers when the train stops. As it turns out, they had all died previous to their departure, and they've just arrived in hell. Sorry for spoiling it, if it even had to be said, but it's important to discuss it, as it's such an iconic ending to an anthology that it became almost cliched from future entries insisting on utilizing it as the framing device for their stories. Not to mention that if you watched this film for the first time in the last couple of decades, you would have seen the twist coming from a mile down the tracks. Milton's ass definitely didn't help, as he did this trope 3 or 4 more times. Dr. Terror's House of Horrors marked the beginning of the Amicus series of anthology films, spearheaded by Milton Subotsky, who would even go on to produce anthologies without the help of Amicus. That's how much this guy liked the format. He just wanted more and more anthologies, and hey, if they're selling, then why stop? Most notable from his catalog besides Dr. Terror's House of Horrors are Asylum and his adaptation of the comic book series Tales from the Crypt, which was disappointing. That's not the fucking Crypt Keeper. This is. Other important horror anthology films to mention from the time are Night Gallery, released in 1969. Which is basically the pilot for Rod Serling's follow-up series to The Twilight Zone, titled Night Gallery. It goes without saying. They put the first 3 episodes into a feature, kept the introduction from Rod, and called it a day, starring the likes of Roddy McDowall, Joan Crawford, and Ossie Davis, as well as the directorial debut of Steven Spielberg. Each segment is actually very interesting and well executed, but my favorite has to be the very first one. The Cemetery, where an insufferable and greedy Roddy McDowall just can't wait for his inheritance, and then is haunted by the ghost of his uncle, or so he thinks. Or so he thinks. Yeah, you gotta love those patented Rod Serling twists. The other big hitter is 1975's Trilogy of Terror, a collection of Richard Matheson stories, hello again, directed by Dan Curtis. This film is most known for having 2 mediocre installments followed by one of the most memorable segments of all time. No, but for real, the first 2 stories are pretty understated and tame, and then the final one just goes ball to the wall.
It's just the one ball, actually.
And then the final one just goes balls to the wall with it. All 3 of these segments feature Karen Black in the lead role, which is the first time that this was done with a woman and not Vincent Price. One of the reasons that anthologies get made is for their profitability. Shorts aren't that profitable by themselves, that goes without saying, but anthologies offer something unique. With an anthology film, you can attach multiple different big-name players in the scene, each with their own built-in fan base. This makes producers' eyes light up green. And generally, this can be a win-win for everyone. which is why anthologies featuring established directors are so common. A big-name director gets to work with a bit of a budget on a project that won't consume 2 to 5 years of their life. They get to experiment a bit, collaborate with some of their peers, and on top of that, because they also don't have to dedicate a lot of their time, A-list actors are stoked to get on board as well, either for the story or for the chance to work with the director or writer involved, bringing in a bigger audience and further incentivizing the production of anthologies. One of the biggest and most memorable anthologies is one made because two giants in the horror scene just couldn't seem to get the stars to align on a project with both of them involved. So they just decided, fuck it, we'll do it ourselves. Creepshow is a film released in 1982 that sees the melding of two of the most beloved minds in horror, Stephen King writing and George A. Romero directing, with the third pillar being Tom Savini on special effects and trash duty. The film features a bookend segment of a kid played by Stephen King's son Joe. No, not Stephen, Joe. Yeah, no DNA test needed. He plays a kid that's being berated by his dad, Tom Atkins, for the atrocious crime of reading those dastardly comic books. Which is kind of exactly how things were with Tales from the Crypt and other EC comic horror novels, and even their non-horror novels in the 50s and 60s. Old people blaming violence and their kids being different on new media is eternal, I guess. Those darn comic books? Don't like them. Too violent. Me, slapping the shit out of my kid? Nah, it's not violent at all. Anyways, Tom slaps Joe and throws out the comic book, beginning the linking part between the segments. Creepshow is quite possibly the most popular horror anthology. King and Romero were inspired by the 50s horror comic book series from EC Comics. Creepshow wears this inspiration on its sleeve, featuring art in the style of comic books, harsh lighting, split screen and borders used in the segments with video, and great effects from the legend Tom Savini, which makes the film so stylish and visually interesting. The film is a project of joy and passion from everyone involved, and it really does show. When the film released, critics didn't really like it a whole lot, but the revenue had a different story. Creepshow turned a profit at the box office, and that success absolutely had an impact on how execs viewed the public's favor of anthologies, leading to the production of a lot of really decent anthologies in the coming decade. Twilight Zone, based on the TV show The Twilight Zone, has several popular episodes from the series getting their big budget spin by famous directors, Steven Spielberg, Joe Dante, and George Miller. Most notably, it features the segment Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, with Miller directing, story by Richard Matheson, hello again, and John Lithgow leading. This is one of the most popular shorts from an anthology in my mind, and for good reason. It did for plane rides what Final Destination did for log transporting. Company of Wolves. Company of Wolves, which is much to my delight a fairy tale inspired anthology with nothing but stories about fucking werewolves, featuring some slick effects, that special color you could only get in the 70s, and wonderful set design. Hell yeah. Cat's Eye, which is basically a compilation of several shorts by Stephen King, featuring a sort of wraparound with a cat that shows up through the first two installments before arriving at his destination in the final segment. Starts off strong with Quitters Inc., takes a step back with The Ledge, and then ends it nicely with General. It is also a part of the Birds Are Assholes cinematic universe. The final segment is very fun to watch because of the lovely effects work going on. This movie is peak cocaine era Stephen King horror. And finally, but definitely not least, Tales from the Dark Side, based on the series that George A. Romero did after he wasn't quite done with Creepshow, featuring a mummy story starring Steve Buscemi.
You know, Lee, I think the most...
Hello?
Potentially my favorite of Stephen King's novellas, The Cat from Hell, adapted fantastically for the screen with one of my favorite actors in the lead role, William Hickey, and an Americanized, i.e. butchered, version of the Yuki-onna tale that was earlier shown in Kwaidan. Also, hey Second Raiden, this, along with Creepshow, were the main anthologies that I grew up watching, and I'm glad to see that it holds up so well. Unlike the others, but still of note from the time, is Der Todesking, The Death King, from Jörg Buttgereit, the director of the infamous Necromantic, centered around the theme of death, featuring a different segment for each day of the week, and a persisting link of a corpse rotting throughout the film. This one is very nice, with a lot of different approaches to the subject. There's actually a lot of good foreign anthologies that stuck out to me. Rampeau Noir, Shogun's Joy of Torture, Fears of the Dark, and even Jose Mojica Marin's jumped aboard and made an anthology with The Strange World of Coffin Joe. It was just difficult to find a place to slip them in within the framework that I limited myself to with this video. One thing I learned pretty quickly while doing the research for this video and watching right around 100 films in 6 weeks is that watching a ton of anthologies in rapid succession just isn't that fun. Like, yeah, that's my problem and not something anyone would ever take into account when making a film, that it would be the 5th movie in a row of 7 movies that someone is watching all in the span of one day. But it gave me a deeper appreciation for the films that included a wraparound segment. It was a moment of downtime, a walk back into reality for a moment where we can take a breath as we gear up for the next segment. I think the prime scenario for watching an anthology is when you're in the mood for short stories that are tightly told, and essentially you're looking for someone else to curate those stories for you. That's probably why characters like Rod Serling and the Crypt Keeper were so amazing. Much like the blockbuster employee that knows just what film you would like, they're the people the viewer would go to for their recommendation, making them more memorable than, and also integral to the stories that they told. That is to say, a good wraparound, and by extension, a good host, makes all the difference in an anthology film. Tales from the Hood is a 1995 horror anthology directed by Rusty Cundieff, who co-wrote the film with Darren Scott. As they're all directed by the same person, and wonderfully so might I add, as far as the quality and the choices being made goes. However, it leaves little to talk about when it comes to technical aspects, as no one segment drastically sticks out above the rest. They're all of very similar quality, with good sound work and the occasional inspired camera angle or editing. But I really want to talk about just how serious the tone of these shorts are. Not only are they heavy topics, ranging from police brutality to domestic abuse to institutionalized racism, and last but certainly not least, gang violence, the final segment even showing actual images of lynchings, cross-cut with images of the main character's actions. But they're also portrayed with the utmost sincerity. The over-the-top horror elements of the segments do not detract from the message that they are getting across. It's honestly already a great anthology with just the 4 segments alone, but the story still needs something to break up the gravity of the segments. It needs that cherry on top to make it a masterpiece. The wraparound story is of 3 drug dealers who head to a funeral home in order to pick up 1 or 2 marijuanas from the owner, Mr. Sims, claiming that he found the drugs, but that he has them put up for safekeeping. While leading them into the good stuff, he tells them stories to keep them entertained. How thoughtful. The biggest thing that the wraparound brings to the table is the contrast of levity against the serious tones of the individual segments, providing a much-needed retreat with one of the most charismatic hosts in anthology films and plenty of humor.
It's a way station for lost souls.
What? There are plenty of films where the wraparound far outshines the individual segments. Grim Prairie Tales comes to mind, featuring Brad Dourif and James Earl Jones telling each other stories during a cold night out on the prairie. But a more apt comparison would be Body Bags, where the most memorable part of the film is the wraparound narrative featuring the corpse of John Carpenter walking around a morgue like he owns the place as he introduces the 3 segments of the film. I don't like to be negative, so I won't spend too long on this, but to put it succinctly, the stories do not even begin to compare to just how great that wraparound is. You end up spending the runtime waiting on the short to end just so you can see more of John Carpenter.
Nighty-night.
Meanwhile, with Tales from the Hood, the stories all can hold up on their own, without the wraparound, but the inclusion of it just ties it up in a neat little bow that turned this film into an instant classic, and made it one of the best horror anthologies out there. TV anthologies are admittedly better, for quite a few reasons, but one of those reasons is something that is a huge issue with a lot of anthology films, and it's the quality of an individual segment. With TV anthologies, you know within a margin of a few minutes just how long each segment will be, making it easier to watch as a whole. But if an episode just isn't vibing with you, not only do you know how much longer it has, you also have the ability to just re-roll and skip to the next episode. This feature combined with the aforementioned charismatic host usually being linked by a theme and of a consistent image and story quality, makes television a much better format to watch anthologies on. Film does not have those benefits. If one segment isn't going well, you have no idea how much longer you have to sit through it. You can't exactly just skip to the next one. And more often than not, films will have either one segment that greatly eclipses the others, or they will have one segment, sometimes more, that is just so horrible that it ruins the entire film as a whole. Nothing sucks worse than going back to show someone a great anthology film and saying, "We normally just skip those," to 2 out of 5 of the segments. Almost half the damn film. So let's take a look at an example of an anthology film that doesn't have these problems. All segments are roughly the same length, same quality, and are damn near perfect stories, each in their own unique way. Three Extremes is a 2004 film serving as a showcase for 3 East Asian directors. Fruit Chan from Hong Kong with his short Dumplings, that was later released as a feature-length film, Park Chan-wook from South Korea with his short Cut, and Takashi Miike from Japan with his short The Box. I would assume most horror or film fans would recognize at least 2 of these names, so you already know you're in for a good experience. Each of these short films are masterclasses, both in storytelling and technical prowess. In most cases, the compliments that I would give to one segment would also be warranted for the others. They each have great acting, wonderful sound, spectacular cinematography, good pacing, and on top of that, they don't overstay their welcome and manage to flow very well from one to another, despite the different directors and crews for each of them. Individually, Dumplings has a wonderful topic of aging and the persistent pursuit of youth, along with above-average cinematography with the help of the always-on-point Christopher Doyle. Cut takes a wonderful juxtaposition and just sits on it the whole duration, adding in little moments of comedy. The Box also has beautiful cinematography with a wonderful setting boosting it, contrasting with the uncomfortable and unsettling themes on display. These segments are all powerhouses in their own right, and it's nothing short of amazing that they're all contained within the same anthology film. Wraparound segments are like a good rug. They really tie the room together. Without a wraparound segment or a strict adherence to a theme, the film just plays like a collection of short films. And that's the best case scenario you can hope for. Sometimes there's a loose theme involved keeping things relatively in line, but a lot of the films I watched just had no link or theme besides maybe being horror. Apparently that was optional for a horror anthology. Go figure. However, films that introduced a wraparound story typically would have an inclination to stick to a theme between the stories, and thus making them flow a lot better. Whereas films without a wraparound were frequently disjointed in not only the quality of the segments, but also the themes, and felt more like someone hit shuffle on the story generator and said, "Here you go." This isn't to say that an anthology film requires a wraparound in order to be good, or that the films that were more like a grab bag of random shorts added into a playlist were always worse. But I did notice that I had a much better time watching the ones with a wraparound, and the anthology was generally better off as a whole. What's truly important here are themes. If you're going to exclude a wraparound, you should carefully construct your segments so that they still have flow and cohesion between them. So let's talk about a film that doesn't necessarily have a wraparound segment, but is so tightly woven that all of its segments flow effortlessly into each other, making for one hell of a watch every Halloween. Trick or Treat, written and directed by Michael Dougherty, features 5 stories of mischief, prankery, and devilishness, all linked by the core of Halloween traditions, that are more akin to rules for a certain festive participator. This film teeters on the line of being called an anthology. It's edited much more like hyperlink cinema, with the cross-cutting back and forth with the past, present, and future, with sprinkles of other stories embedded into the beginnings of others, making the world-building of this film top-notch. Being both written and directed by the same person, as well as constructed mostly from the beginning with all parts in mind, these segments flow effortlessly from one entertaining story to the next. Combined with the comic book-inspired stylings, a stacked cast, and segments that all bring the heat while being so expertly woven together, this film is a yearly staple for a reason. If you don't watch this film on Halloween, then I don't really know what you're doing.
Happy Halloween! Screw you!
It's got everything a horror fan could really want. Child murder, child murderer, Brian Cox, cool little dude Sam, tales of comeuppance, and we can't forget the sick-ass werewolves. Sweet dreams are indeed made of these. All of these elements are wrapped neatly in the package of an anthology that has stood the test of time as one of the best horror films. So, when's the last time you went to see a short film in theaters? Outside of being a part of a select few people who are both inclined to and lucky enough to get to attend film festivals, you probably won't even encounter a theater that will show short films. I've seen a shit ton of films, both feature and short, but when I go to my Letterboxd account and I sort my films by length, it's bizarre how few of them are shorts, which serves as an example of the societal bias against short films and how hard filmmakers producing shorts have to work to get their films seen and recognized in comparison to features. One of my favorite things to do when I'm not in the mood to find a movie or watch YouTube is to load up a playlist of short horror films. As a filmmaker myself, there's a lot of lessons to be learned this way. What makes one work and another one not work, for example. But even as a viewer, it's a fun experience. Such a vast array of different styles and approaches to a multitude of subjects. Short films give budding filmmakers a place to experiment and hone their craft. And as a sad fact, and actually sad fact this time, that they just won't ever be taken as seriously as feature films outside of, even then, a small portion of the filmmaking community. And that's exactly why I have such admiration for anthologies that feature the work of several non-established directors. People who most likely haven't gotten the chance to direct a feature film, but are undoubtedly equipped to tell stories. VHS is a found footage-inspired anthology series. Well, shit. Yeah, no duh, the found footage nerd likes this one. The Wraparounds segment is of some really unlikable characters as they break into a house, where they watch videotapes, each containing one of our segments. Not Dane Cook getting not the guy from Good Mythical Morning to record some girls without their permission, a stranger at the door, a thief in the night, a toothbrush dipped in toilet water, a digital glitch serial killer, a ghost story but it's actually aliens, and that's capped off with a segment of some dudes just being bros. On the topic of non-established directors in anthology films, Ty West and Joe Swanberg came into the anthology with features already under their belt. Ty West with two films that I actually really enjoy, The Innkeepers and House of the Devil, and Joe Swanberg being renowned for his films that would later be grouped into the non-movement of mumblecore. Ty West is also experiencing some well-deserved success with his ex-Pearl franchise thingamajig right now. Adam Wingard, director and star of The Wraparound, would go on to direct The Guest, Death Note, Blair Witch, and Godzilla vs. Kong. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of the films themselves, besides The Guest, you can't help but admire the trajectory that this guy's career has had. David Bruckner, who directed the first segment, Amateur Night, and it's totally not my favorite just because there's a monster girl, I like the gimmick of spy glasses. The gore effects are pretty neat. After this film, Bruckner went on to make The Ritual, which I thought was pretty neat. Go figure. He also did The Signal and Night House. The Hellraiser remake I didn't see, and is currently attached to the Blob remake. The collaborative directing group called Radio Silence directed the fifth and final segment, which is the funnest segment in my opinion. A nanny cam bear, a pirate, a marine, and the Unabomber hop in a car. That's not the setup to a joke, that's just how the film starts. Two members of the group, Tyler Gillette and Matt Bettinelli-Olpin, would go on to direct Scream 5 and 6, as well as Ready or Not. This is possibly the best an anthology film can be in the modern era. The overall popularity, combined with its cost-effective found footage framework, obviously means that there would be sequels, VHS 2 and VHS Viral being released yearly back-to-back before a hiatus. Then in 2021, with the help of Shudder, we got VHS 94, which started the yearly releases again, and I couldn't be more happy about that. Every Halloween I'm getting blessed with some bite-sized found footage popcorn flicks. Fuck yeah, dude. This topic has almost come up a few times now, but I wanted to save it, and hopefully for a good reason. Runtimes. The biggest glaring issue that I ran into with anthology films were the goddamn runtimes. Oh, this film is 90 minutes? If that's 3 segments without a wraparound, then I guess that's about 25 to 30 minutes for each segment. Cool. No, not cool. It was very rare that the segments would be evenly distributed like this, which I guess wouldn't be so much of an issue if only there wasn't such a prevalence of stories overstaying their welcome. Rarely did I find myself saying, damn, I wish that was longer. Meanwhile, I stopped counting how many times I wanted a segment to just hurry up and end. I started noticing a little pattern that I will hereby dub the ailment plaguing short horror films as they approach a runtime mirroring that of the minimum required runtime of a feature film. 40-minute curse. It's called the 40-minute curse. Look, attention spans are not getting any better. The closer a segment is to approaching the 40-minute timer, the more the viewer questions if that story really is worth the time of day that they're giving it. The more time a story takes up, the higher our expectations are for them. And the true curse in this scenario is that in most cases, the story almost felt less worth it solely because of its close proximity to that 40 minutes. It all goes back to short stories, and I guess storytelling in general. How much time does the story at hand really need? If you take a feature film and you cut it down to about 40 minutes, it feels like there's just way too much going on. Or that nothing makes sense because you haven't had time to grasp what the fuck is going on. Or too much got cut out of the film. Similarly, let's say you take a 10-minute story and you fluff it up a bit to about 25, maybe 30 minutes. And all of a sudden, the pacing is super slow and the film feels extremely bloated with a whole lot of scenes that do and expand on nothing. Both of these scenarios are bad. As a filmmaker, you should know, relatively, how long the story you are trying to tell should take. There shouldn't be a single shot or line of dialogue that doesn't in itself service the story. A very important quote for anyone in any field really, creative or otherwise, is, "Perfection is achieved, not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away." So let's have a look at a film that takes short stories very literally. ABCs of Death 2. Yeah, we're talking about the second one for obvious reasons. If you know, you know. And if you know, I'm sorry. If you haven't seen the first one, don't watch it. Just watch the second one. I cannot emphasize this enough. Second, ABCs of Death 2, the second one, is a horror anthology series with a unique gimmick, taking 26 directors from around the globe, giving them $5,000 for a budget, alongside a letter of the English alphabet, and telling them just to go crazy. Thankfully for the second one, they vetted their directors with much more scrutiny. Now, if I were to discuss 26 shorts, we'd be here all day. So instead, I went through and grabbed the ones that stuck out to me, mainly wanting to show that with this format, you'll be getting a lot of variety with the segments. We open up the film guns a-blazing with A is for amateur. Humorous, and I love the use of subtle horror like claustrophobia. Wonderful way to start the film. Immediately following after A is Badger. A cocky prima donna actor is badgering, wink wink, his crew on the set of a documentary about a thought-to-be-abandoned Badger set. Some fun behind-the-scenes banter and another entry that mixes horror with comedy. D is for Deloused. Showcasing the variety of styles that are present in this anthology, is a stop-motion animated short that brings the creepy vibes and imagery. E is for Equilibrium. Less horror, but brings the comedy that makes short films under the 5-minute mark much more enjoyable. Sin beer indeed. I is for Invincible. I've seen a very limited amount of Filipino horror films, but this short blew the others out of the water. Splash of comedy involved, and great effects. M is for Masticate. The producers of the anthology film actually held a contest for the letter M, which would then have 26 of the entries for that contest put together for the spin-off film ABCs of Death 2.5, which I do actually recommend as well. The one featured in this anthology being the winner of that contest. This is a fun short with a great ending that makes it very memorable. O is for Okiocracy. This one is just a super interesting premise that almost always comes up when I think about zombie films. If there were suddenly a cure that could revert the zombification process, What would happen? Well, in this world, people get put on trial for the murder of zombies. See what I mean by interesting? P is for scary. This entry is a great example of the stylistic experiments and just general fun that people normally wouldn't get to produce without a short format like this. It's evocative of a lot of my favorite horror shorts that you can only find on YouTube, and it's very charming. R is for roulette. I mention this one to further show the varied scope of the shorts in this anthology, where you can see stop-motion animation, Jackass-inspired slow-mo, and a somewhat serious and well-shot table scene. W is for wish, drenched in 80s cartoon show aesthetics with elements of comedy and an unsettling conclusion. Psycho Goreman director Steven Kostanski took that budget and stretched it as far as he goddamn could, and might have just made the most visually appealing short film among the collection. Y is for youth. Framed as a text message that a young woman is writing to her parents, we see her frustrations represented uniquely on screen. This short is poetic, combined with fun depictions and great style, making it one of my favorites. So yeah, such a wide variety of shorts from directors from all over, all put on display in a neat little accessible package. What's not to love about this? You can throw it on in the background or sit down to watch. And anytime one of the segments isn't vibing with you, you just go grab a refill or another piece of candy, and when you get back, another one will be on. I wish there were more anthologies like this, honestly. This format, comprised of a ton of shorts that are under 5 minutes, is just perfect for experimentation and just having fun. But that's not all there is for anthology horror. There are, of course, more films to mention from the modern era. All Hallows Eve from makeup and special effects guy turned director Damien Leone, whose creation, Art the Clown, would become so popular that he got his own spin-off movie that is now turning into its own little cult franchise. Southbound, an anthology with multiple directors attached, most of which were actually involved with VHS. The story involves an isolated desert road that serves as the crossroads for 5 groups of people as their lives start to intersect. Zipper merge, deer in headlights, blinker fluid, more automobile puns. Ghost Stories, where we follow a skeptical professor as he attempts to debunk supernatural stories from various sources. A fun ride that never lets up on the uneasy feeling, with an enjoyable conclusion. And finally, Scare Package. A very charming and enjoyable slight meta-commentary on horror as a genre, while engaging in and even joking with itself. A film that exudes a certain geekiness that only horror aficionados truly can, and wears it like a badge of honor.
Re-recording outro. Take 1. Clap sync. At the end of the day, anthology films and their limitations just can't hold a candle to the freedom that their TV counterparts were afforded. With TV anthologies, you can binge as many episodes as you want. You can skip the ones that you don't like, or you could just put it on in the background while you sleep or do chores around the house, much like how you probably watch this video. Despite this, I feel that the anthology film niche is a very important one, whether it be to show a wider audience more short stories, or as a collaborative effort between industry giants, or even industry newcomers. They also have a unique charm and structure to them that makes them amazing for watching during Halloween and horror-themed hangouts. Although I don't quite think that they'll ever touch the peak that was the 80s boom, I think anthology horror films have had one hell of a journey. A very important one that I'm glad, in one way or another, is still going. I'd like to leave you all with a quote from a guy on Reddit. If you are a horror movie fan, you should just accept that a lot of our movies are bad. Truer words have never been spoken. As horror movie fans, we really don't ask for a lot. So just tell us some stories. I've been Hound. Later.